He's breaking up for me. How's he doing with you?
He's
Shit here.
he froze.
Am I
Yeah.
better now? Am I better now or no? Can you
You're
hear me
still
now?
very hazy.
Yeah,
Uh, uh,
your video is kind of hazy. Turning off your video might help.
Hi, is that better?
Yes.
That's better.
Excellent. So I was just going to say, I think it's fascinating to connect some of y'all's research and thinking together because Jack's certainly relevant to Steve's transformation alliances. One way to think about it, I think, is Jack has been working on some of the meta infrastructure for transformation at a systems level of technology, theory of knowledge, and some of the Engelbartian ideals with regards to what transformation is needed. And I think that Steve's research across networks that allow for transformation would very much benefit from this thesis that Jack's been working towards, which I think is to say that all contextuality that has not been applied at a disciplinary level is a collective blind spot and an individual blind spot, and that is the opportunity for one field to have consequences for another. That is where complexity science and where the social science of knowledge becomes an opportunity for the present tense to get better at in terms of understanding itself than each other context in which we've had cumulative knowledge before. I don't know if that's a appropriate way to paraphrase Jack, but I'd welcome to get beyond my paraphrase and get a firsthand version of that narrative. And we may have oh, hi Davi, welcome Davi. And actually, Steve, were you there when Davi was here before last? I don't know if you met Davi last week.
No,
Uh,
last
I
week.
think there's some really interesting threads also from Davi's research and perspective. So I'll also invite him to introduce himself after. And Davi, we're recording this now so that we can share this more broadly for this series. But did you want to share a brief encapsulation of some of the theories of yours that I was alluding to?
You ask me.
Yeah, Jack, would you mind?
Um, it kind of begins. I'm going to do this as quickly as I can. It kind of begins with the idea that I used to think that I could be really smart if my computer was a companion, and together the apparent IQ of myself and my computer, I was talking AI in those days, would be far the apparent IQ would be higher than either of the computer or me. And I told this to Douglas Engelbart, and he said, "What's this me stuff? It's all about we." And so I made that me to we shift, and made all of my AI stuff open source, and decided it needed to be shared and that we needed to work in groups. So I started studying the dynamics of the social dynamics of guilds in World of Warcraft, and began to realize there's a way to bring us together. Um, I I got paid to be engaged in the development of the XML topic map standard. So topic maps became my sort of north star for how I think. Uh, so when it's this meta level, how do we federate all of the great ideas of people all over the planet and put them in one place, so that they're findable, trackable, and they keep and the topics in the topic map basically are self-aware. They know when they learn when things change. So that's the biggest possible picture of
Hmm.
where I'm at.
Hmm. Well, that sounds very. I was gonna say that sounds very interesting. It sounds so mundane to say that.
It sounds what? I'm
It
sorry.
sounds so mundane to say that. Um, so
Well,
what?
I can assure you that, Steve, Jack's ideas and ideals and research are not mundane. They are, I think, a fascinating
Oh no, I was saying
interest.
I was saying that what I said was mundane. To
No,
say
I do
that it's
agree.
interesting sounds mundane.
I see.
Um, So I work with the around this concept of transformation systems. So transformation systems are something we talk about as all of those who are trying to push for transformation in a particular direction, create a system around the current system structure. And the difficulty is that, well, there's numerous difficulties, but one of them is that there's no sense of being part of a system. There's no system consciousness among all of those initiatives and all those people who are pushing together. They just think in terms of what they're doing. And so it's about how do we evolve the system's consciousness. And so it's very relevant to what you're talking about in terms of knowledge maps and understanding how to bring people across from different to see for people to see their connections and I guess the other thing that really resonates for me is that I think I find that one of the fundamental avenues for transformation is redefining our sense of boundaries. That leads to fundamentally new insights and new configurations of power and structures.
Excellent. I think that Karl's here as well. Karl, we're recording, and we'll also be sharing this. Davi, did you want to introduce yourself? Because I don't think that Steve or Jack have met you. Maybe Karl did. I'm not sure. Karl, were you there when Davi was here last? Okay. We'll let Davi introduce himself.
Well, pleasure to see some of you again, and Jack, pleasure to meet you. Definitely seems a very interesting topic you're talking about. I'm a computer science psychology major, so I am very interested about this relationship between what is the human and what is the not human, and the human as an individual and the human as a humanity as a collective. So definitely would like to take a look at the work that you're doing. I'm Davi. I'm a senior at Yale. I'm going to my master's at Peking University starting next semester. Learned about it last week, so I'm still in kind of like celebratory mode. I work with 3 different projects right now. The most relevant, I think, to what we're talking about is this project called Open Climate, which is, to Steve's point, it's trying to be a system of systems. Or a platform of platforms, if you want to call it that, regarding climate accounting. So it's supposed to be a one public, transparent, decentralized ledger of carbon accounting that also includes carbon financing. So in the same place, you'd have state actors and non-state actors doing their, like a dashboard for them in a way to keep track of their carbon emissions and their reductions, and also the possible trading that happens all through there, the financing of that, green bonds, everything there that would be able to connect with all the legacy systems that we currently have, and basically put the Paris Agreement on a smart contract and allow the agents to collaborate through the transparency of information more effectively. So I think it's very interesting to both of the points that you guys are bringing about the collective power that come along through this collaboration with the technology.
That's a fascinating way to cross-reference it. And let me welcome Saskia. Saskia, Jack was just sharing around the quality that can allow us new insight into current context, and was also discussing some of the collaboration process for such. Did you want to briefly introduce yourself to him, and then we can let Karl do the same, and then we can proceed to the rest of our systemic change intentionality here.
Thanks, Bobby. I hope my system holds up because I've had some issues with the network this morning, so I hope you can hear me okay. I'm Saskia. I'm based in New Zealand. I lead Match for Action, which is an organization that looks to match people to good causes wherever there's the need for it. And one of our key strategies is radical collaboration to accelerate social impact. So radical collaboration in a way that crosses the lines of what normally would have seen as the possibilities for collaboration. So where Previously, probably competition would have been seen as the way to operate in ecosystems. We try and collaborate across that to see if, or because we believe really that together we can create that acceleration of impact that we really need to solve the problems in the world. Outside of Metro Action, I actually also am an executive within a tourism company, which is currently in a very interesting state of organization. And the great thing around system thinking and collaboration that I've been doing with Metro Action, we can see here in New Zealand, in the tourism industry, the only way to survive this crisis, really from a tourism perspective currently, greatly is seen as a systems thinking challenge. So that is really going to be really interesting to see what comes out of that. But even the government seems to be buying into that now, that we need to collaborate across all the lines to come up with a redesigned industry, because the way it was not working. That was for prior to the virus, but it certainly isn't working right now. And it's going to be interesting to see how all these points come together, and we can hopefully redesign with a systems thinking hat on the industry here in New Zealand.
I think that would be phenomenal for systems thinking to allow us to reach collective systems change. And if we're not wary of the consequences of ignoring complex systems before the pandemic, we should all be better systems thinkers to deal with the post-pandemic global interconnected complexity level for us all the time. I believe in scaling collaboration proportion to the problems. I think that I saw one of the Jim Rutt's podcasts this week, and he had an episode about protocols for getting collaboration to the scale that we need it as a frame. And I think that there's a collaboration gap around a lot of these social innovation frames. I see that Grant has also joined us and Karl's joined us. Let me invite Karl, if you wanted to briefly introduce yourself and comment on what you've heard so far, and I can also then let Grant do the same, and then we could proceed to systems change intentionality. And we are recording this, so this will be shared subsequently, so FYI. You're on mute, Karl. Or I can't hear you. We'll come back to Karl when the mic's working. I'm not getting any audio from Karl. Grant, would you like to introduce for who haven't met you? Jack Park is here for the first time in our systems change call.
Yeah, hi. Good evening, everyone. Grant Holton from Amsterdam. We've co-founder of Sustainavistas, a group of about over 200 Cambridge trained leadership in sustainability leadership, and we're focusing on the business side of sustainability management. So, and obviously well, the objective of us is to apply the knowledge that we've learned on the course, and we've been sort of cooperating on webinars, seminars, and then obviously recently we joined forces with CrowdDoing and Bobby and with this opportunity with the European Investment Bank, which on Debt for Nature, and then we obviously took that to Skoll last week, which was actually quite successful and a lot of fun. Still learning and still processing all the things that we did. Yeah, and glad to meet all of you again. And obviously, a few of you we've been meeting over the last few weeks and months. So yeah, good evening.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Grant. And I agree that it was excellent to have the Skoll Road Forum hackathon. We've got some interesting learnings from that too. We can connect to further. Karl, is your mic working now?
Hello.
Hi, Karl. We can hear you now. Karl? We can hear you now, but you can't hear us. Okay. No worries. So all good. So I want to connect to the question that exists from a different set of starting points based on some of what was being alluded to, which is effectively Jack was alluding to where there's an intersectionality of context and the potential for context to reveal new paths to address the collective intentionality. The context could be a cumulative context of historical dimensions. A context could be other dimensions from the perspective of what is possible that folks are not aware of. Oh, Karl, are you back?
I am back. Can you hear me?
We can hear you now. Excellent.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Karl Shergren, Oakland, California, author of the Fair Model about a performance-based capital structure for venture stage initial public offering. To Saskia's point, there's a chapter in here called Cooperation as the New Tool for Competition. And interestingly, one of the people I reference in the book is a guy named Walter Scheib, who wrote a book about the great levelers of inequality. And one of the levelers he refers to is a pandemic.
That's a fascinating part of that history that I was not aware of in terms of the consequences of pandemics historically. Although I think I have, along with everyone else, been learning different parts of history than I was noticing before the pandemic changed the salience of new parts of history.
His theory about the effect of pandemics is that it reduces inequality because fewer workers results in a rise in real wages and the value of capital assets fall. I wonder if that would be necessarily the case where we see automation playing such a significant part of the economy and displacing labor.
I think it's fascinating to connect to the macro implications. Okay, we've just gone around a set of introductions. This is recorded so we can also share with you the part that happened just over the last few minutes here. But did you want to also share an introduction before we continue on our thread of systemic change?
Hey, thanks for including me, and I appreciate everybody seeing many of you guys back here again post-school. I am in my car, so things might be a little bumpy as I'm talking because I had to pick something up for my gardening, which ended up being a pickup curbside. And we're wondering about, in terms of inequality, all the people who are in the construction industry seem to be working fine, you know. In the sense they're working. So what about them, right? And they don't seem to be impacted by the pandemic. So I'm really curious if they are going to be actually paid more for their services at this time. And talking in terms of value, right? There's much more value they are providing for society right now. So
I think that it's fascinating to say, not just for that sector, but for any sector that is affected by this, how are roles going to shift on a sectoral level in a post-pandemic context. I do think that there's a degree to which virtual contextualization of work will change for everybody. And this brings us back to the context thread that Jack was sharing earlier. I'm just going to share a screen for 2 minutes of sharing one part of our research that comes together with this. So can you see my screen? Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
So these are all the leverage points that we've identified for systemic change. And if we think about each of them from the lens of context, which ones are leveraged, which ones are not leveraged, AI and machine learning is really a way of learning through automation about context and the contextual implications of what's possible for transformation accordingly. If we look at multidisciplinary integration, that is also context as superpower. When we talk about, in the medicinal foods team, Ayurvedic medicine, traditional Chinese medicine, naturopathy, nutrition, functional medicine, and more than 100 other fields that we've mapped connect to that. So similarly, if we look at social innovation surveying for replication, you could also connect that to some of the big history work that Jack was alluding to at the beginning of the call, in that it's also about understanding the history of where a problem has been solved. If we look at service learning, it's saying the learning has to happen in the context of an impact purpose. If we look at micro leadership, It's saying that the person needs agency over a context. If we look at cumulative history, that's also a reuse and upcycling of context. If we look at tacit knowledge, it doesn't exist without context, because tacit knowledge is only revealed and released when you discover a context with shared expertise. If we look at liquidity, fungibility, property rights, I think that that's where we have existing financial tools that are ubiquitous, that are not contextual to people. And the fact that there are systems that fail people is about how they lack contextual applicability. I think serious gaming is that curiosity, drive, and fun can be contextual to transformation and systems change. If we look at citizen science, it's the context that we don't have only scientists and only experts that we can outsource responsibility to, that there's a context for each of us individually, that individual sovereignty is something that we each feel contextually if we can harness it. I think even inherent liability, that's the externalities that exist in the world that are harmful in their context. If we look at underutilized law, that's exampling Series 82 could democratize investment banking. Again, that's that the law has not been applied to the context that is important, so it's a neglected context. If we look at social innovation clustering, that's putting social innovations into context. Virtual skilled volunteering, it's the purpose alignment of skills, can be contextualized. If we look at radical collaboration, that's the context reveals new opportunities for coalitions that have not formed before to become contextualizable. I think likewise there. In-kind funds, in-kind resources, and all other resources are economically valuable in proportionate to the degree to which they've been appropriately contextualized. If we contextualize in-kind resources, we can make that possible too. Consequences of consequences, I think that's the implications for context that we care about as stakeholders. If we map stakeholders to context, we might be able to apply the same there. And interdisciplinary adjacency, evidence of wastification, that's about the context of what we know and what we don't know, and how we research the gap and address the collective scientific gap and knowledge gaps. So I'm just going to pause there and reconnect to Jack's thread. Jack, did you want to share a bit more about your research on context from the perspective of, we have people on the line that are interested in cherishing and championing transformation. I think that Steve's ecosystem connects to that aspirational goal, for example. I think that Grant's coalition of hundreds of sustainability experts who are relatively optimistic about the world, they hope for transformational feasibility too. So if we think about where this meta of context connects to this feasibility, it'd be really interesting to get your perspective, to share a bit more of that, of your context that connects to that intention.
Well, let me just preface what I would say with the fact that I come at this from the mindset of a topic mapper. A topic map is fundamentally the same thing as a road map, except that it deals with symbolic structures that represent people, places, things, and relationships. You're familiar with mind maps, which are very simple graphs, and the arcs have no labels. And then a concept map, which is very familiar in the classroom, is bubbles with labeled arcs connecting them. And a topic map is the same bubbles with arcs, but the arcs are actually bubbles. The arcs are topics themselves. And the reason for that is because if you make a claim, A is a subject and B is a subject, and A causes B, that's a causal claim. It's an event, and therefore the event is a topic. So the fact that you claim there's a relationship between two other topics, that relationship has a biography, and the topic map needs to be able to keep track of the biography. And this takes us to this thing called context. It's one thing to have these now famous knowledge graphs, which are bubbles with labeled arcs, and it's quite another to be able to dive into the arc itself, because the arc itself is the event. You're hearing about the edge.org, which was started by his name escapes me, but he's a famous fellow that promotes authors and now writes his own books, and he holds conversations with all manner of people, famous people, and what they're talking about is relationships. The action is in the relation, not in the actors themselves so much. Although the actors have the intentionality to cause the relation, that's a different part of it. So I got interested in this thing called big history. Big history came to me because I was asked to give a talk in Tokyo about citizen science in the context of an open source Watson project. And so I invented this thing I called the global timeline. I had in mind James Burke and his connections. If you've ever watched the connections videos, by the way, they're on YouTube. They're awesome. You're learning how things are connected in ways that you're not familiar with. By the way, one of the Easter eggs in the connection series is the question, who brought chewing gum to America? And that's something you'll have to dig up yourself. But at any rate, I'm interested in taking James Burke's connections and marrying that with Wikipedia, the idea that you have topics that are very, very carefully curated, but I want to do it not in Wikipedia, but in a topic map, which is far more powerful than Wikipedia. Takes nothing away from Wikipedia, by the way. I'm just saying there's a more powerful way to do this kind of information. And then marry that with the social dynamics of World of Warcraft, where you actually can have lots and lots and lots of people doing deep research, bringing topics together, but they bring them together in such a way that they self-curate, so that what comes out of the guild is very, very deep and rich and carefully curated information resources, which go in the topic map, but which are also placed on a gigantic timeline. The reason for the timeline is because you really want to have the temporal history behind these kinds of events that you're recording. It's not enough to just say, so-and-so climbed this mountain and fought this war. It's quite another to know all of the other things going on around it. It's system thinking very writ large. In fact, it comes from something that is now known as relational biology.
Relational biology? I've not heard that phrase before. Can you explain what that is for a moment?
So there's this fellow named Nicholas Rashevsky who back in the 30s or 40s invented what we now call mathematical biology when he discovered the reaction diffusion equations, which allowed us to then begin to calculate what metabolic rates were and all sorts of things. He brought mathematics to what was mostly a lab science. And in 1954, the same year Watson and Crick went public with what DNA is, he went public with a paper called Topology in Life, in which he basically said this: you know, we can tease open a living cell under a microscope and we can count all the parts, but we can't put it back together. And he says, we clearly don't have any clue what life is. It's not enough to have all of these really interesting mathematical equations. What we need is a mathematics of life. And what he claimed is that when you take these parts out of a living cell and count them, you broke the relationships, not only among themselves, but between them and the external environment. You can begin to see the system thinking coming into biology. So he said, let's call this relational biology. And that was the beginning of a whole new science. It turns out that his grad...
You had some questions, Jack, from the chat of the World of Warcraft Guild frame, just because some folks didn't have, I think, some of the context.
Fair enough.
If you wanted to just add for just a moment, you were sharing around the theory of how many people you can know and collaborate with, and how that is related to the way you've seen game behavior exist. That might be helpful context for folks. And then after that, I also see Yangbo joined us, so I'll invite him to introduce himself, and then we can also get feedback on some of what the threads that you've started here, Jack.
Yeah, I talk too fast and go right over my own self sometimes. Sorry about that. That's a good question. Robin Dunbar, the famous British psychologist, calculated that the largest stable social network humans could maintain was 150 plus or minus a couple. And he based that calculation on herd sizes of large animals. Figured we're a large animal. But he recently co-authored a paper in which it actually is 5. And that correlates with what the world cafes say in their book about running using cafe tables, seat no more than 4 or 5 people at a table. And so when you go into a guild in say World of Warcraft or any of the massive role-playing games, you get broken up into subgroups. And Dunbar said this is how you do it. If you've got a large crowd, break them up into small subgroups, and then have one person from the subgroup report out to the larger group, and it tames this mass of people in a room. But there's more going on in guilds. The guild leadership has this ability to say, look, you're not behaving. You shouldn't be in this guild. But there's also the game mechanics of leaderboards and winning game moves, which causes people to go into the World of Warcraft and want to win. So if it takes them a while to migrate from their usual egocentric behaviors to the necessary ecocentric behaviors it takes to be in a guild, that's what World of Warcraft does. Now, Google this quote, and you'll find John Seeley Brown saying this in a 6-minute YouTube. I would rather hire a high-level World of Warcraft player than an MBA from Harvard. That pretty much says it all.
Well, look, I think there's room for different kinds of skills, but I love John Seeley Brown's on a new culture of learning about who learns most exponentially. And I think his point is these games are designed, the massive ones that have been designed for extreme levels of learning. And that's something that we can draw into any impact system we orient towards. Yangbo, did you want to share an introduction? We did an early round of introductions, and this is being recorded, so I can also share the ones you missed with you after.
First, right, so you can hear me now. I mute myself. So again, great to reconnect. Saskia, Bobby, Sanjay, Grant, Karl, and Steve from Skull Forum. So just very quickly, I used to do 6 years of research in energy and environmental policy. I was back at T, then last 7-8 years co-founding social enterprises. Now my focus is on mainstreaming impact finance, mainly around green infrastructure, around the issue of climate action, reducing inequalities, and eradicating poverty. So effectively presenting the 17 sustainable development goals as business opportunity, as a prosperity agenda, just changing a narrative around those things. So that's very quickly, and glad that you touched upon systems thinking earlier about, because that's actually, I've been telling people for years that if you could only take one course at MIT in your life, system thinking, that's the one in the Sloan School of Management.
And I think that the systems thinking practice that exists in serious games and the systems thinking practice that exists in any complex challenge is capacity building for people to have experience with. That's where VUCA skills are picked up, engaging with complex systems, learning and aligning to networks that have the potential to transform them. I want to invite Steve, if he wanted to offer additional feedback based on what Jack shared, because of course networks for transformation are things that you're thinking about a great deal, and I think that some of what Jack alluded to is the context for such.
Well, it's totally relevant to what we do. I mean, one thing is the more mundane part for me is around the understanding the relationships between or helping people move through relationships between different sources of knowledge. But the bigger thing that I'm touching on, Jack, is we're just designing a project right now that arises from the COVID-19 crisis. And it's saying this is an opportunity where people's minds and assumptions have been fundamentally challenged, and that it's an opportunity for us to really in a purposeful way, realize a transformation, support a transformational direction, which we have a very specific meaning of what transformation means. But it's, so we're talking about two challenges. One is fragmentation of concepts around the economy, the new economy, the future economy, very different from 2008. Today, when I tried to do something similar, today there is relatively good development of ideas around circular economy, the donut economics, the common good economy, the regenerative economy, etc. So, but these ideas are still fragmented, and they are not, how to bring them together is part of the question. And then how to do this, we've been talking about Delphi process or some crowdsourcing methods for being able to bring together a group that's very involved in developing these visions of the new economy, the definition of what it is, the possibilities, and then having a parallel or subsequent process that would be best described as a global conversation about actions that we can take to be able to realize this economy, and wanting to do this very rapidly. So it seems what you're saying is somehow relevant to that.
On what Jack shared as an initial thread, but before I do so, Jack, did you want to share anything on what Steve just shared there about that?
I just want to say these two
Jack?
words, violent agreement.
Excellent. Absolutely. And I think that that agreement is fascinating in order to get to collective agreement. If we think about solar punk as one destination of alternative future, and we think about all of the map of alternative futures, the adjacent possibles that exist in the world, there's a question of which ones to navigate towards, and there's a question of which means would cause us to reach a destination intact and unscathed by all the different alternative universes that we could accidentally end up in if we're not conscientious about where we're navigating towards. So I think that there's a context here. I want to go around the room for other folks that have feedback on the thread that was offered. Davi, did you want to offer feedback on what Jack shared, or what Steve shared in reaction on that? Davi?
Sorry, my connection's kind of weak right now, but I don't have any thoughts that come to mind. No, thank you.
All good. Let's see. Going around the room for the same. Saskia, did you want to offer feedback on this thread that has been raised by Jack?
I can just say that I find it very interesting. I've written down heaps of things that I need to further investigate that I hadn't heard of before. So, and I'm super, like the whole comparison to World of Warcraft, I find absolutely fascinating, and I want to know more about that too. So that's where I'll leave it for now.
Absolutely. And I think that there's the potential for gamification is one way that that's been looked at, but you could also say World of Warcraft within the guild have tacit knowledge networks and are learning in particular speed because they have aligned incentives for roles. They're differentiated and overlapping, and you could talk about knowledge transfer, knowledge gains in those contexts as particularly feasible. Grant, did you want to offer feedback or commentary on some of the threads that Jack has shared or that other colleagues have shared in reaction?
Yeah, look, obviously very interesting about the gamification aspect, but also you know, the sort of collaboration of people aligning themselves, although like allies in this, and I think that makes it quite really interesting that you know that's the only way to do it, and then actually putting forward people, the diplomats or the speakers or the leaders, to go and share with the other groups as well. Quite an interesting concept. I think that another one which I thought was quite interesting, that was, and our network is also very focused on business, and was also seeing how the different groups. It was also to the coronavirus and the pandemic, which is I think is the big next step for a lot of us, and how America. Well, I think you guys just approved 2.2 trillion, and all the sustainability and all the things, the investments and all the things that you really want to get your economy going in the right direction have been left out and stripped out. You know, the airlines, no incentive for renewables and investment and innovation on anything new and to save the climate and the planet. And then the EU today is sort of, or this week has come out and said that they're going to spend, what I think, 580 billion. And all of that's all in helping countries affected by the coronavirus, but a lot of that's all tied into long-term sustainability goals. And I think that that's also wanting to see if the group and also Jack had some ideas of how, sorry, excuse me, I've got a frog in the throat, and how you see those different approaches also in this theory. How do you bridge those gaps? Because there's really big fundamental gaps in that area. How do we make those fundamental changes?
Jack, would you like to comment on what Grant shared?
Yeah, it takes me a moment to find my button. Grant, I need a brief repeat on the fundamental differences so I can tie it together, please.
Well, the one group, Europe is actually saying that the Green Deal and investing in environment and innovation around the environment is actually a core part of investing, and all the money that they're throwing at the pandemic and recovery, the economic recovery, is all going to be tied to good kind of investment and good kind of renewables and green ecology, biodiversity, and all the things that we really need. All the solutions that the planet really needs are also part of this. But America has taken a total different tact, and they're throwing a lot more money at it. But it's also going business as usual, going back into the billionaires and the millionaires and all these big companies and the people that are running the stock exchange again.
Okay.
Business as usual, and back into the silos and back into traditional fossil fuels and all those kind of things again.
Yeah. So
Well,
go ahead. Somebody was going to go ahead.
Yeah, I was about to bring in that actually just came on not long ago, less than 24 hours ago, that Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, he was literally just shot across the bow at Washington, and he literally said, we're going to act on procurement for team as a nation state in coalition with other governors, much like what some of the governors around Great Lakes states are doing. So you're seeing them change that. You're basically seeing that since given the federal government, they've been AWOL through much of this, that state governments in the states, well, you could think of them as EU member states themselves as an equivalent. Just think of Washington as our clunkier version of Brussels, to keep it simple. But so basically, the states are now trying to take things in their own hands, given how the federal government's AWOL at all this.
Yangwu makes the point that I would like to make, and that is, when you say America is going this direction, you're talking about, and my apologies here, a baboon that we put in the POTUS seat, and he doesn't understand the world and its problems as it should be. But there are individuals and large municipalities and entire states within the United States who do understand the problem and are acting accordingly. My game is called knowledge federation. The idea that we can tie together the wisdom and the ideas and the worldviews of all people, whether we agree with them or not, is not what counts. What counts is the idea of collecting in a civic and civil way all of the worldviews as great as possible. I do that. This is, by the way, very Douglas Engelbartian, in that you need to find a way to bring humans and their tool systems together and co-evolve them so that their capabilities rise to the occasion of ever more complex and urgent and in fact, wicked problems. So when I gave a talk in Seoul in 2007, and I renamed the whole idea of Engelbart into something called knowledge gardening. And the idea is that you would use World of Warcraft like games to make game moves which are around quests about matters that matter. What do we know about the causes of climate change? What do we know about women's rights? What do we know about clean water, et cetera, et cetera? And we accumulate that in a federation. And that knows no national or international boundaries. This is humankind coming together, trying to collect their wisdom. And what I wanted to do was put that all in the context of a gigantic global timeline at the same time. That I'm going to stop there.
It's fascinating to have these threads come together. I just want to invite the other folks in the room if they wanted to share additional feedback. Sanjay, did you want to offer commentary on what you've heard here?
Yeah, so fascinated by the whole discussion on the new economy, the Delphi process, and the guild dynamics that we're talking about, and the world of Warcraft. I'm curious. I wanted to draw an analogy. In mechanical engineering, or when you're trying to find the impact of any particular activity, say you're pushing on a bench and you want to see where the pressure points are, what you do is called finite element analysis. So you take the whole bench and you break it down as small as possible. So what's called discretization. So you break it down to the smallest element, find the impact on the smallest element, and then you assimilate all of them, get back to the bench to figure out what the big pressure points are, right? So it's like going from the macro to the micro level, almost to the individual, because it's a complex system we're talking about. So we need to find the impacts at the localized level and then bubble it all up to see how all of these tie together in the context of, the macro, almost like the mind map that Jack was talking about. I can see it's almost like a 3 or a multidimensional mind map, right? That you can see. But I just wanted to draw that analogy because that is what is done in mechanical engineering, to find the impact on the table by looking at the smallest and then expanding it back to the table itself. Does that make sense?
If I may comment on that, my undergraduate work was in aeronautical engineering, and we were doing finite analysis. We did that. But when I got out into the real world and had to analyze to do my own research to get rid of a leukemia I was diagnosed with, that's when I really got deep into this Rashevsky stuff. This is systems thinking now, and systems thinkers have said that reductionism, which is functionally what finite element analysis is, does not work in complex, specifically living systems. There was a distinction made that in mechanical systems, you can have something that's very complicated, even with little feedback loops, servo mechanisms and so forth, but it's still complicated, but it is not in the same sense complex as our basically complex adaptive anticipatory systems. All living systems are model driven. They have anticipation. And you can't know what my model is, and I can't know what your model is. So there's no way I can take you apart and figure out what you're thinking. So
you may not be able to figure out what they're thinking, and that may be a part that is buried beneath the visibility due to complexity. But if you look at functional medicine as a frame of reference, which is really the systems thinker critique of medicine, and where their goal is to say it's a complex system of a human body, but you can still see that there's a functional goal. If you want to reduce stress via inflammatory response, you can have black pepper and turmeric, and it'll have 2000% the bioabsorption it would otherwise, and you can achieve that goal. So in other words, agency and tools can still exist in a complex system without being reductionist, but it's hubristic to think that we're able to be omniscient vis-a-vis the consequences of that complexity, or the unintended side effects of assuming that we know all of the potential outcomes that could occur should we behave like a tool that works much of the time will be guaranteed to work all of the time. It won't in a complex system.
Yeah, my comment is we all practice reductionism, whether we're holistic thinkers or not. And the reductionism will, it's like Rashevsky said, you can count the parts and you can even make better microscopes and see more parts. But you have to leave the reductionism and escape that into the relational thinking in order to make sense of all of those parts.
Karl,
Very
did you
true.
want to speak? Oh, go ahead, Sanjay.
No, very true. I think it's fascinating, the discussion, and thanks for drawing the difference with reductionism. I appreciate that for sure.
Karl, did you want to offer commentary on what you've heard here?
Yeah, this has been fun. I like Jack's line that reductionism does not work in complex systems, because when Jack, you started talking earlier, I was thinking about how we analyze things, cause and effect. And for me, I often find that if I can organize cause and effect, or sort of like a spreadsheet, rows and columns, if I could break down something into rows and columns, I have the ability to understand it better, or the drivers. And oftentimes one of the row might be time related. And so many things that deal with mind mapping and understanding relationships, time has some influence, but it may not be the key one. Take, for example, the whole idea of self-government, right? An alternative to feudal forms of government. Philosophers were debating checks and balances and ideas like this that are key decades before the U.S. was formed. The U.S. was the first one to actually experiment with it, and that same idea applied in France turned out to be a disaster. But so you have decades, half century more between expressions of accountability and the actual attempt to do it. So the driver or the relationship doesn't necessarily seem like it should be time. It should be something else. So basically, I hung my hat on your comment. Reductionism does not work in complex systems, and we're left with the thought of, well, artificial intelligence probably learns something, analyzes complex systems using reductionism, because it has to develop rules. And I'm just sort of musing about what is that idea of reductionism in complex systems mean in self-learning systems.
Well, and I think also to this point, you've identified the challenge of a quest or an epic goal that someone takes on. And Steve wrote a fascinating comment about that I'll also invite him to share. But if we think about the quest not as an attempt to reductionistly understand, but if you think about it as growth hacking, usually you have 250 experiments in the backlog of things that you can de-risk, and then you pick one at a time to de-risk test, and then that de-risks that kind of process. And you can think about the same in terms of quests for demystifying how do we get to transformational consequence. Would you like to offer context on that, Steve? I saw you wrote a comment there that was interesting around participatory culture.
It's just something that I saw that Jack Park presented at the Transform conference, a phrase that was in one of his slides. And it's just so totally appropriate for what the position is that I think is important to take in what I and what my community is trying to do. It's not about there being an answer. It's about it being a quest. And it's about what I describe as living into our highest ideals and greatest potential. And there's no absolute end to that. It's about a modus of operating It's about a way of being. And how can we do that? That's totally the challenge that we're trying to face. So I just really appreciate the citation of what Jack wrote.
Jack, did you want to offer commentary on what was shared in reaction to some of your work and the allusion to that part of your research?
I'll comment in this way. For me, it's enormously gratifying to be able to have a deep conversation with thinkers who are clearly deeper than I am and get this kind of feedback. I put links to two of my slides in the chat room, one that was just referenced and one I gave just recently to the CO2 Foundation, which is up in Seattle, Washington. These ideas, the fact that I can be in this room with these people and people actually understand what I'm saying, it's it's being a lot of fun. My head's getting about to where it's going to explode, so I'm going to shut up again.
The soul, because if you have the possibility of systems change, then you don't have to get frustrated with the slow pace of incremental progress, because you're working on a different narrative that may be overlaid with the same world that we're in, but you're rooting for a different pathway to have optimism, have a chance for yourself in the world. And I think that's where the possibility of transformation that overcomes these gaps, whether the gaps in terms of complexity, the gaps in terms of cumulativity, the gaps in terms of contextuality, that allow us to still have leverage towards being able to make our aspirations feasible. That's part of what tacit knowledge networks are for. This is a tacit knowledge network. Dominique Foray wrote The Economics of Knowledge about the liquidity premium of tacit information grows exponentially as everything else becomes Googleable. Now, where is tacit knowledge important? It's when we have an aspiration that cannot be reached through purely our own disciplinary context, but we need interdisciplinary parallax in order to see what's possible. Now, where does that get to transformational feasibility? I think that's an interesting question. That's a thresholding question. We started here 5 minutes late, so we can end slightly late, but I just want to see if we have a last round of commentary from each person in the room, and then we can adjourn for today, and I can share this subsequently as it's been recorded, and we can share some of the systems change thinking with folks who might appreciate. I've been trying to share in a pandemic context more by videoing than we have historically, because I think it's especially important to show folks who've not had the habits of collaborative systems change virtually what's possible, more light in terms of what systems change is feasible. Davi, did you want to offer any commentary before we adjourn? I'm just going to go around the room. And
yes, I wanted to, again, I feel similarly to Jack, very grateful and thankful for the opportunity to be surrounded and within such interesting and bright minds. And I wanted to, in the sense of systems thinking, and as we talked about in the beginning as well, like of creating action, right? And a systems of systems in a way, of extend the invitation to all of you guys for the Climate Collaborathon that I'm helping to organize April 22nd to 26th. I'll send the link on the chat. We're looking for people to organize nodes. That would be basically a center of gravity for the Collaborathon. And we're trying to look for models and advisors also on how can we organize this event, like radical collaboration towards solving the climate accounting financing problem. And we're also looking for sponsors. So if you guys are interested, if you guys can know companies which would be interested, also we're looking for those. And if you guys also want to participate, we will be collecting individual signups and then dividing up on teams with people who have technical background on blockchain, on product development, and systems thinkers. So I think everyone here is more than equipped to participate, and I would welcome you to check it out. So
I agree that everyone here is equipped, but I would say that getting to a utopian level of being equipped for systemic change is a long journey. And if this is our guild of fellow systems change makers, then I appreciate this tacit knowledge network so that we can all become exponentially better equipped for systems change than we ever thought possible in isolation. So that's part of the spirit of gathering here too. Sanjay, did you want to offer any last commentary before we wrap up? I'm just going to complete the circle and ask everyone the same kind of question here.
No, I really am appreciative of you including me, Bobby, Grant, and thanks so much. Davi, if you can put the link out there, I'd like to figure out mechanisms by which I can help you out. And I think together we are better than individually working on the problem, right?
Definitely.
That's why we have to be in cahoots across disciplinary lines. That's the only way to have exponential feasibility in a finite life. Yangbo, would you like to offer any closing commentary before we wrap up? We're just going to complete one round.
Yes. All right. So yes, and just to sum up some of the discussion over system thinking, that see what's really critical is, and been in discussions about this over the week on off and follow up to Skull Forum, is why not start that at a much younger age than what's been done with the university level, since it's actually the case that people are actually the most impressionable when they're 6 to 8 years old. So why not start there?
I think that building system thinking earlier is important, and it should be a pathway for transformation too. I don't know if you have an education working group, Steve, that connects to that, but maybe that should be added to a global agenda context. In any event, I'm just saying that as part of contextualization. Completing the circle, let's see. Saskia, did you want to offer any last commentary before we wrap up the circle here in a few minutes here?
Okay, Bobby. I just wanted to thank everybody for sharing their knowledge and spending some time with us, working through these things. Every week or every time we do this, I learn so much new context. And it's super helpful. It's super helpful in the current time and the actual challenges that I'm dealing with on the short term as well as long term. So it's really great. Thank you.
Terrific. Karl, any last words before we wrap up? I'm just going around the room and offering the same chance to everyone.
Just going back to the phrase, I think Jack first mentioned it, Sanjay may have done it as well, about mind map. And the thought is that a path forward may be to, when we're trying to share ideas about complex systems, is to build analogies to other complex systems. People at some varying levels will have absorbed cause and effect relationship between other complex systems that they know and have different levels. And I think the key idea behind mind mapping is that there's a growth of ideas from the stem of the trunk of an idea to its various limbs. And humans naturally will sense some type of relationship if it's pointed out to them. And analogies are powerful ways to do it.
I think that's fascinating as a cross-referentiality. And Jack, if you wanted to offer any words of commentary on the frame of analogy as a form of universal contextualization protocol.
Analogy is one of the most powerful ways we reason. And so I totally agree with the framing that Karl gave us. Analogy in computer science is a difficult task. You can do structure mapping if you can make a graph of the properties of the analogy, but doing analogy in AI is it's an unsolved problem, and it's one that we all work on as best we can.
Well, I wish for the analogy and metaphorical engines to be scaled to the feasibility needed for systems change as a general matter. But I won't digress further because we just have two folks left to go to before we wrap up. We have Grant, and then I'll give the last word to Steve for closing commentary before we adjourn for today. Grant, do you have any last commentary before we wrap up?
Yeah, obviously, thanks very much. Great perspective. I mean, obviously, I think a lot of learned people and the intentions and the focus is quite inspirational. I just out of interest, going back to what Yangbo said, is one of my colleagues in our network is based in the UK, is a teacher, and they've put quite an interesting list of resources that these schools in the UK are using on climate change and sustainability for young and middle school. So I put that in the link just for things. But once again, thanks very much for putting this all together, guys, and really looking forward to continue the discussions.
Phenomenal. So turning to Steve, if we're going to leverage all of this new equipment we have in this guild of systems change makers to be able to go on any kind of quest required for systems change feasibility, given that new context, what further transformational intentionality should become feasible?
Good for you, Bobby. Push the boundary. I love you, Bobby. I just want to say how much I appreciate what has been shared today. It is so relevant to exactly what we're working on. We're starting a transformation systems analysis community where we see mapping, large data analysis, and visualization as the key three legs of it. I've done a lot of different mapping methodologies over my life, and I'm just delighted to learn about topic mapping, and just it always reminds me how important it is for me to be humble in what I think I know. And you always broaden my knowledge, Bobby. And thank you so much, Jack.
That's the new contextualization. If big history is that there's always a context we're missing for the present tense to be as feasible as we wish for it to be, then that collective history is something that we harness together. That's a format of collective agency discovery that we have together that we would not in isolation have commensurate feasibility for. So in that spirit, I'd like to express gratitude for all of y'all compounding our collective agency through collective awareness of the feasibility for how systems change can be brought to the scale and scope of our collective aspirations and individual aspirations. And with that, I'd like to wish y'all a phenomenal Friday and look forward to continuing systems change conversations sometime soon, y'all.
Thank you.
Take care.
Yes.
Bye-bye. Thank you.